My job this afternoon and Matt's is to, one, give a kind of pastoral perspective and some practical witness about what we might do in the current situation to help people pastorally. That is, how do we help people where they're at? And Matt's going to also give some testimony to what all this is as a lived reality, especially natural family planning as a lived reality, and what in fact, how this is affecting men and women in our culture as we work with men and women today. So, I've been preaching and teaching about Humanae Vitae for about 21 years, as long as I've been a priest. And I actually am finding in certain ways that it's getting easier. And it's getting easier because it's so radical to people today that they can find it interesting. Well, that's really an interesting idea. You really are against contraception? Yeah, we really are. The other part that's more difficult is, we're about, if you just saw in the last talk from Teresa, we're about 100 years into this experiment, right? 1917 is when it first sort of entered into the church world. And so we're about 100 years into this experiment of contraception. And we're already beginning to see the unraveling, and we've seen it for some time now, and the spiritual damage that's being caused. And a big part of my work as a priest and a bishop is I have to try to help repair that spiritual damage, and that takes a lot of work, and it's going to take a lot of work for us as a church going forward as the spiritual damage continues to unfold in people's lives, just as we have with abortion, right, where we do a lot of healing retreats for women and men who've been affected by abortion. We're dealing with the same issues here. What I want to do is just really talk about two practical things, and then I'll turn it over to Matt for some of his witness. And that's really the pastoral issues, two pastoral issues. What I say to couples when I'm helping prepare them for marriage, and how do I try to sell the church's teaching to couples in marriage, and why that's important. And then after Matt shares, I'll talk a little bit about really what I would call the spirituality of NFP and why this whole thing is actually, in my opinion, a faith issue at its deepest level, and why a faith perspective is so important to try to help people understand that. So just to start with the beginning, where I start with couples when they come to meet with me, one of my former students was mentioning this earlier, but when I would do marriage preparation, and I get to do it rarely these days, but I've done a lot of it over my years as a priest, I would always start with a couple and I'd say, you sit before me, the first meeting, before I find out anything about them, I get to know them a little bit, how'd you meet, how'd you get engaged, those sorts of things. And I'd say, you sit before me with a 50% chance of success, basically, in our society. And I know that you have the same goal as the church today. You coming to be prepared for marriage, you really want your marriage to succeed, and the church has that goal as well. We want your marriage to succeed. But I should tell you, there's some things you could do if you want to increase your chances of divorce. A lot of this, of course, you'll recognize. I got it all from Janet Smith's talk on contraception, why not? But there's things you can do if you want to increase your chances of divorce. First thing you should do is move in together before you're married, because then you've just doubled your chances of divorce. You're at about a 75%. It's actually higher than that, right? Because out of 100 couples who live together, only 15 will end up in lasting marriages, right? But of those who get married, 75% of them divorce. So then I say, well, what if you wanted to go the other way? What if you want to increase your chances of success? Well, then the first thing you should do is start going to church together every Sunday. Because as soon as you go to church together every Sunday, you've got a 75% chance of marriage. And by the way, here's our Mass schedule, and I expect to see you at church. I'll be celebrating some of these Masses. Please come up and say hello to me after Mass so I know you're there. And then if they haven't been there, when I meet them again in a few weeks, I say, I haven't seen you at Mass. But I say, let's suppose that 75% is not good enough for you. You really want to increase your chances. Well, then you should start to pray together every day, because couples who pray together have about a 95% success rate in marriage. I say, but suppose that's not enough. You want to do the best. Well, then you need to follow everything the Catholic Church teaches about marriage, most especially her teaching around contraception and natural family planning, because then you have about a 98 to 99% success rate in marriage. And so I always kind of start with that perspective of you and I have the same desire, and everything I'm going to share with you has that end. And then I go into what we're preparing for, which is a sacrament. Marriage is a sacrament. And I try to help them understand what a sacrament is. Of course, a sacrament is a physical sign that gives grace, that gives us a share in God's own life, right? And in order to be able to receive the grace that the sacrament of marriage wants to give you, you have to live in accord with the sacrament itself. And if your life is in discord with the sacrament, you're not going to receive the grace that the sacrament wants to give, right? And so I talk about those 3 questions that we'll ask them on their wedding day. You remember what the 3 questions are. Have you come here freely and without reservation to give yourselves to each other in marriage? Will you love and honor each other as husband and wife for the rest of your lives? And will you accept children lovingly and bring them up according to the law of Christ and his church? And I try to show them how these 3 questions flow from our understanding of what a sacrament is. Because the sacrament of marriage is a covenant. And a covenant is a very particular kind of relationship. A covenant is a biblically based relationship. And it's a relationship based on this loving gift of myself to another that's total, that is forever, that I don't hold anything back. And then I begin to talk about how sexuality fits into this sacramental structure. Because, as we know, and St. John Paul II taught us, sex itself is a sacrament. It's a sign of a deeper union, a deeper spiritual reality, which is the spiritual union of the couple. And that if I destroy something in the sexual act itself, then I'm actually preventing the grace of the sacrament to work. This is all founded in the church's teaching. You know, we have this teaching still in our canon law that if a couple were to profess vows but never have sexual relations, they could have their marriage annulled, right? Very easily. Because the sexual relations are the sacramental sign of the vows. In the sexual relations, I'm saying with my body what I said when I was on the altar, which is, I want to give myself to you completely. And it's here I go into the 2 dimensions that St. Paul speaks about. That is St. Paul VI, I can say that now. The unitive dimensions and the procreative dimension of marriage. You know, one of the things that can help stir the heart of people is to talk about the beauty of children and to talk about the beauty of a child and the mystery of as a child. And it's already been mentioned today, this whole idea that a child that is created by God with an eternal soul. And that eternal soul will live forever. And from the moment of that conception, it has an eternal destiny, right? That God has plans for that child. And the beautiful image that a child is a subject who can be known and loved by God and by us. And that's what it means to have an eternal soul. And then to show how it's not unrelated that these children come from an act of love. That these 2 things are connected, and it says something about children, that they come from an act of love. And it actually says something about how we're supposed to receive children. Of course, these are very different ways of thinking about it. And I usually joke, as Janet Smith did this morning, about, no one gets pregnant by accident, or people will say, oh, I got pregnant by accident. And I think, were you walking under a tree? What happened, I would say there's only one way to get pregnant, I know, and it's hard to do by accident, right? Actually, in fact, it's this whole idea that a body works the way it's designed to work. Marriage works the way it's designed to work. Your love is so real that 9 months later you might have to give it a name, right? And to help them understand that reality and help them understand a little bit of how our society sees children, which is to see them as a burden, not to see this inestimable value. Sometimes, depending on the couple, I'll even ask them, depending on the thing, on a couple, this used to work better than it does today, but sometimes I would ask them, what number are you in the lineup of your children? And some of them, well, I'm number 5 or I'm number 6, And what number are you? Well, I'm number 6. Or, well, how many children do you want to have? Oh, 2 or 3. Well, thank God your parents were more generous than you, right? But this is a reality for a lot of people in my generation. Their parents were much more generous than them, but they don't think anything of that. They're the fifth or sixth child, but they only have 2 or 3, right? And so this encouragement to generosity, as I tell them, I have yet to meet the couple in their old age who has regretted that they had so many children. And I have yet to meet the couple, even in the midst of the chaos of having many children, who can think of one they want to get rid of, right? In their better moments, right? Just to begin to help them seek about what is a Christian attitude towards children and how, in fact, we're called to generosity. And I'll talk a little bit about that later when I talk about the spirituality of NFP, how it actually pushes us towards what the vocation pushes us towards, which is generosity. The other point I try to make to them is that contraception will also destroy the unitive aspect of their sexual relationship if we allow it. And that is, it's a point that was already been made today, that it makes sex less unitive. Contraceptive sex is less unitive. And then here I just talk about what it is to make a gift of oneself and the beautiful vulnerability that happens in that sexual gift and what it means to hold something back from that sexual gift. I often joke about the very language that we use to speak about contraception, right? We speak about it as protection, right? Like I would need to protect myself from someone that I love. Whereas, in fact, what we're really talking about is an attitude of self-gift. And I do use a lot here St. John Paul II's book, Love and Responsibility, because I've found it to be really the best way to try to help them understand the beauty and the goodness that the sexual act, in fact, can have in their marriage. You know, John Paul II is very convinced that sexuality, like every other area of our life, needs to be and can be sanctified. He believes that it needs to be and that it can be sanctified. And in fact, sometimes he's criticized by that, even within the Christian tradition, right? And he takes a stand that wasn't always upheld in the Christian tradition, that sex itself can be sanctified. Some people have argued that concupiscence is such a strength that it can't be sanctified. But John Paul II is different on this, and he believes that sexuality can be, for us as human beings, a real communion of persons. That is a gift of ourself to another person. And Janet Smith showed beautifully this morning how for that to happen in sexuality, it's required that one be open to parenthood and that we're open completely to the personhood of the other and all that sex means. What he really shows in his Love and Responsibility is the importance of reverence and how reverence is an essential part of love and how all of the abuses in the area of sexuality go against reverence and they turn what's meant to be an act of giving into an act of taking. All of the abuses of sexuality are in some form an act of taking, not giving. And this reverence, which allows sexuality to be a communion of persons, requires a few things. It requires a commitment for life, that I'm in this for the long term, because I'm not just using this person for my pleasure now, I'm in this for the long term. It requires that openness to life, because I have to be totally open to the other person. And of course, parenthood requires as well that I'm in this for the long term, right? It means that I don't enter into this relationship holding anything back. I want to make a gift of myself completely to the other. The point that St. John Paul II makes, he got a lot of criticism for this at the time, is that it's actually possible to sin in the way I have sex in marriage. That sex in marriage isn't always free of sin, right? And that there's actually a way that one has to approach sexuality within marriage that allows it to be sanctified. And that's not just using contraception, but any way that would objectify the other person, that would turn the other person into an object and not a subject. And he has this beautiful teaching about how in the area of sexuality, there's always, because of original sin, the problem of shame. Shame is connected to sexuality within the human person because of original sin. This is what causes, by the way, all the spiritual damage in people, right? So when people in our culture give in to the sexual revolution, the pain, the spiritual pain that happens to them comes from the shame from having engaged in sex in the wrong way. But John Paul II points out that in marriage, what happens is that love covers the shame. He talks about how in this way it allows us to go back to the beginning, as he says in his Theology of the Body, where we can be naked without shame because of the commitment of love. That is, when a couple really enters into marriage and they commit themselves to this self-giving love completely, then there's no shame in being naked before each other, and there's no shame in sexuality. What I find is couples, and especially women, begin to really appreciate this idea and this teaching, and especially the understanding of reverence, and how reverence for the other takes shame out of sexuality. And it's the only thing that can, is this love covering shame. And I use two examples. One is an old Ann Landers survey. Maybe you heard this. This was a great Ann Landers survey. I might have learned this from Contraception Why Not too. I don't remember. I don't remember where I learned all these facts. But Ann Landers once did a survey of all of her women readers. Of course, this was when she was writing in the 80s. And the question was, how many of you women would prefer to be held by your husbands and not to actually have sex? And 70% of women answered yes to that question. Married women said, I'd prefer to be held by my husband and not to actually have sex, right? Which tells you that at some level, a very high degree of married women were in fact feeling used as an object, right? And not as a subject, not reverenced, right? So Couple-to-Couple League saw that survey, and they decided to do their own survey of all the couples using natural family planning, Couple-to-Couple League. How many of you in your marriage would prefer to be held by your husbands and not to actually have sex? Women who are using NFP. And it was 7%, right? Why? Well, because, of course, they were being held 4 to 9 days every month, right? Because NFP helps teach this reverence, which is what marriage is supposed to have, right? It's supposed to have. I just want to make one final point that I used to make. I had a friend of mine who, at the time I was serving as her spiritual director, she's given me permission to share this story, and she was working in the marriage tribunal. And she was a reporter, or like a recorder, for people who were seeking annulments. And she was a newly married woman. And so all she did was record the stories of the people who were seeking an annulment, and they have an interview where they ask them certain questions, and she would record what they said. And one of the questions they ask couples when they come for an annulment is, did you ever have sex in a way that was open to life? Okay? Because that could go against one of the goods of marriage, and it could invalidate the covenant if there was not an intention to be open to life. And she was stunned at how many couples said yes to that who were now seeking annulments, the high percentage. And then she thought to herself, she said, they've never experienced what I already experienced in my own marriage, which is this complete gift of myself to another person. That I would be completely open, even open to being a mother with this person. No wonder their marriages failed, because they never experienced that, what the sacrament is supposed to do, what the sacrament of sexuality is supposed to do, which is to make us one because we're completely given to each other. Contraception prevents that. Just want to make one final point before I turn it over to Matt, and that is another point that I often make pastorally, and it's a very difficult point, but it's simply from St. Paul, which is the wages of sin is death. Romans 6:23. The wages of sin is death. And that is, when we sin, it pays us back with death in our life. It invites death into our life. This is why it takes so long for young people in our culture to heal from living promiscuous lives, right? It takes them a long time to overcome the shame and the self-condemnation and the pain of that. And having worked with many young people in spiritual direction, I know all about that. And one of the keys I see, and the reason that we have lost, I think, in certain ways, the moral battle around Humanae Vitae, there's a real key principle that St. Paul VI makes in Humanae Vitae. And it's this principle, and it's really the foundation of all Catholic moral theology. And it's this: one may never do evil that good may come. One may never do evil that good may come. As soon as I admit that principle, every evil is possible, right? This is how Hitler justified the killing of the Jews. He acknowledged it was an evil thing, but it was for a good, a much greater good. Any evil is possible as soon as I lose that principle. And that's the foundational principle that St. Paul VI builds Humanae Vitae upon. There might be a good reason to avoid having children. I have to use a good means. I may never do evil that good may come. And if I do evil, well, the wages of sin is death. And it's going to invite death into my marriage and death into my life. And we've been talking about those results for a long time this morning. Just one example of this, I've had many experiences now in dealing with couples who were sterilized or sought sterilization and then experienced the death that brought into their marriage and their lives, and then came for some kind of pastoral counseling and said, women who said, I'm having nightmares about babies and I'm sterilized, but I can't stop dreaming about babies, men who came to realize that what they did was wrong. And one of the questions they would always ask me is, does the church require me to undo the sterilization? And I always say no, the church would not require you, because the church wouldn't require you to go to extraordinary means to repair your sin. But God might require you. He might. And you have to pray about it. Because your conscience can require you to do things that the church would not require you to do. And I can tell you that 2 times I've done that. A year or 2 later, I've gotten pictures of babies. They said, God required it of me, and here's the result, with a lot of gratitude. But it's an example of where you see this wages of sin is death, and if people are spiritually attuned, if they wake up, they see how it's brought death into their life. I'm going to turn it over to Matt, who's going to give us some of his witness. Matt is, of course, known around the world for being a Super Bowl champion, but in the Archdiocese, we know him for being a champion for life. So we're grateful for you, Matt.
Thank you. I'm a little disappointed you had so many jokes. I kind of pride myself on being funny. Or my wife says I like to try to be funny. I haven't been here the whole day, but I know you've had a lot of amazing speakers, people who are absolutely world-class, so I think that Dr. Savage probably thought that you needed a little break from all that esoteric discussion, and they decided to bring a football player up here, kind of dumb it down for you. I'm so thankful to the church and to the popes and to bishops and priests who have the intellectual capacity and the clarity to think about this stuff and break it down to where I can understand it, because I couldn't articulate or maybe get to the truth on my own, but when I see the truth, I know it. And I know when I read Humanae Vitae, that was written 50 years ago, it's just so prophetic and so true to who God is and what He created us for. I look at the whole sexual revolution, if you want to call it that. So I guess I'm here to kind of take the sexual revolution and Humanae Vitae and sort of how it plays on the street, if you will. That's where I am. I'm on the street. So, the sexual revolution, right? It's this whole mantra that if it feels good, do it, right? That instant gratification is good, and what feels better than having sex? Well, I know one thing: making love feels better than having sex, because sure. Because God is love, And you look at sort of where we are, we lived in such a sexed up society right now. And I look at what is the definition of manhood? How does society judge men? Well, first of all, when you're a young boy, it's about who's the biggest or the fastest or the most athletic. We tend to recognize and praise that, right? And then boys get to high school, and there's a part of society measures then by sexual conquest, right? And that's getting younger and younger as the years go by. And then as you get out of high school and out of college and into the world, it's about how much money can you make, right? We look at that as a sign of manhood. And you look at the first part, the athleticism, and the third part, making money, and those deal with sexual conquest as well. Those will help you have more sexual conquests in our society. And we're told that that's good, that we've broken down sex into just basically a transaction, right? It's just a transaction between two people with, quote, no strings attached. And for, I think, our society, I think the pervasive ideology is that's fine. That's good. You know, get what you need out of it, that it's all about you. And I think that specifically to men, how this perpetuates itself, how this vicious circle continues, is before men. I mean, when they're still boys, right? All they see is they're just bombarded with these sexually explicit images. I read something the other day. It says that the average age that the first where the kid sees their first pornographic image is age 11. Right, with these cell phones. It's not they're looking for it, it comes to them. And so, right, I mean, you're 11 years old and you see that. You have no idea what to make of that. And it's totally confusing. And then everywhere you look, it's scantily clad women, and it's all these messages about sex. And men when they're teens or early 20s, right? I mean, it's a brilliant strategy by Satan. I mean, what do men like to do? We like to sit around and watch football. So when you're watching football, we're going to show you commercials that have sexual undertones, right? There's cheerleaders at football games. We're going to show you beer commercials, and then we have these commercials with Visalis and Cialis and not Visalis, but Viagra. I don't know. It's two people in bathtubs outside. I don't know what the hell that is, but that's right. But we kind of, I mean, we almost try to keep men entrapped in this thinking, right? Where, I mean, we probably think about sex enough on our own, but with all these constant promptings, right? It's almost inescapable. And so you look at, right? I think men are kind of, a lot of them are trapped. What do women become? Women are just viewed as sexual objects, just vehicles for pleasure. That's all they're seen as. And when that transaction occurs, and where the man is viewing it as just a transaction, and the woman, it's something more, there's great hurt there, right? And then there's damage to the woman. And you look at our society today, we have 40+% of households are without the father. 40% of our kids are growing up without a father in there. In the inner city of Chicago, I read it's close to 90%. And the statistics are clear as a bell, that if a father is present in the house, the chances for teenage pregnancy, for drug use, to go to jail, I mean, all those go dramatically down when the father's in the house. To graduate high school, to go to college, all those go dramatically up. If we want to fix the problem in the ghettos in America, the only thing we have to do is men just have to marry women and stay there. That'll solve it. It's not a government program. That will solve it. So this whole sexual revolution, which was billed as this, freedom, do whatever you want. I don't know if it's a slow road to hell. It seems like it might be a fast road to hell, right? Because that's not what we were built for. That's not what we were built for. I don't want to sit up here and make it sound like, I'm got all the answers. I've been on the right track my whole life. I'll tell you, when I was, after I grew up Catholic, strayed. So when I was in my early 20s, I was, people are Jewish. I was Catholic-ish, I mean, I was Catholic, but not really. So I was dating a young woman who I was quite smitten with, and she became pregnant. And I think that was God's way, because God knows me, and He made me. He said, I know you're going to screw this up. Right? And I'm not saying it wasn't the Immaculate Conception, but it was close. But she became pregnant. And so I said, well, I love you, and we need to get married, without understanding what God's plan for marriage was. So we went through our pre-Cana, and I mean, it was more about, I was kind of listening, I was nodding my head, but I was like, come on, we got, we're on the clock here. We got to get this done, get the wedding going. And so I was very much entering into my marriage from a societal perspective, with not understanding what God's plan for marriage was. And when my wife gave birth to our first child, right, then everything changed. Right, that was I knew that I witnessed a miracle. Then and there, I felt differently about my wife, who is now the mother of our child. I said, "Okay, this is great. Let's have more kids." Right? So we're trying to have more kids, and nothing's happening. And I was like, "Come on, God, really?" I was like, the first one, and now, so. Between our first child and our second child. By the way, I just say I'm going to get to the natural family planning, but I'm not an expert, because I've never really practiced it. Okay, I mean, we've always been open to life. So, but 3 years between the first one, our first child, and our second child, and so the second one comes like, oh my gosh, right? Waited 3 years to welcome another child, and say I had to work for it, but it was I knew that it was a blessing, right? So I was like, okay. I was like, geez, 3 years between kids, that's a good spacing, that's nice. The one's just kind of getting out of diapers, that's great. And then it went year and a half, right? So again, not how I would have designed it, but open to whatever God's plan was. So we have 6 biological children. And after the 6th, we're no longer to have children. But first 3 girls, next 3 boys. I mean, we're like the Brady Bunch, right? This is perfect. In fact, name the last one Brady. It's like, this is good. Okay? So, can't have any more children. All right, God, I hear you loud and clear. 6, we're good. This is great. Right? Retire from football, win the Super Bowl. Go on a couple years, youngest one out of diapers. I mean, I'm kind of sailing along, I'm like, yeah, life's pretty good. I'm 40, 6 kids out of diapers. Then my wife says, I think we need to open ourselves up for adoption. This is where kind of this is my connection to natural family planning. I was like, really? I don't know. I'm starting to get good at golf, and kids are in school. And all right, I'm like, no one's gonna choose us to place their child with us. We already have 6 kids, right? And so we go through the process, and our profile becomes available. And the first day our profile is available to be viewed, 2 birth moms pick us. Again, God, this wouldn't be my plan, but okay. So I have 2 2-year-olds. They're, well. They're 6 months apart. I call them, you've heard Irish twins, I call them Polish twins. Because Polak jokes used to be funny, but they're kind of not anymore. Apologies to any Polish people. But I guess it goes to this, is when, I guess the part I left out. After I got married, I was very fortunate to come across a couple in San Antonio, Texas, Greg and Julie Alexander. And the Alexander House, if you're looking for a resource. And they really, it was just kind of, right, God gives you exactly what you need, exactly when you need it. They said, well, do you know what God's plan for marriage is? And I said, well, I just thought, you You find a gal who you're attracted to and you get along with, and you get married and have babies, and it's all good. But really had no idea what God's plan for marriage was, right? Society teaches us that it's, you're going to get married and make sure your needs are met, right? Like, I guess I'm supposed to come home and dinner's on the table and got my slippers and newspaper by my favorite chair or whatever, right? But that's what society teaches us, right? Now, if you're not happy, if you're not happy, you should leave. If you're not getting what you need out of it, you should leave. That's not God's plan for marriage. The two become one, right? Marriage is about dying to yourself. It's about making a covenant, like the covenant Jesus made with Israel, a covenant in front of God, a promise, right? And it's about helping each other grow in holiness. When God created, when he created my wife, he had me in mind as her husband. And I know hopefully someday I get to the pearly gates and God's going to say, you better brought your wife with you. And if I didn't, I think he's going to be pretty upset with me, right? That's God's plan for marriage. That's totally countercultural. And everything against it, this sexual revolution is preaching, is selling. It's not about you. There is no you anymore. And so working with Greg and Julie over the years, and it's interesting because they've worked with over 4,000 couples. We're called these marriage disciples. They've worked with 4,000 couples over the years. 97%. And they don't work with couples that are just like, oh, my marriage could be a little better. Because nobody says that, right? We're just like, my marriage is fine, until it's really not, till it's horrible. 4,000 couples, 97% of the couples that they've worked with over the years, the number one issue is sex. And it shouldn't be surprising because of the culture that we live in and what it promotes. And so you look at the teachings of the church and how they haven't changed, and you look at this this 50th anniversary of Humanae Vitae, and it's more true today, or everything that it predicted has come to roost. And I think most people would agree we can't continue down the same road, right? And we're just, we're human beings, so, right, we tried it our way. Okay, it didn't work again. So now maybe we're ripe for the tide to turn and try it God's way. I just have to use this joke. I don't know if it fits or not, but it's good. So if you think about if you're in your marriage and you're trying to live out God's plan for marriage, right? The what might seem like big things aren't really big things. Like if I'm in it for myself and I'm thinking my needs need to be met, right? Men, we all know that a yes at 5 o'clock does not necessarily mean yes at 10 o'clock, right? In fact, more often than not, it doesn't mean yes at 10 o'clock, right? But if that's what we're concerned about, if it's all about my needs being met, not how God wants me to be in this relationship, about my needs being met, that's a problem. That's a problem. And so when my buddy told me that joke, it's not really a joke because it's true, but I said, well, okay. So at 10 o'clock when my wife is fast asleep, I say, you know what? How great is it that this woman is giving everything she has to the 8 children that we've been blessed with, and to me, her 9th, that she's so exhausted that she can't even stay awake for another 5 minutes. Okay. Now, like all passions of the flesh, it's hard, right? I mean, you read the document, you read the church, you nod your head, yeah, this is right, but it's hard, right? And that's kind of the point. Like a lot of teachings of our church, I look at it as two things. You either choose the pain of discipline or the pain of regret. right? And the pain of discipline is up front, and it goes away because when you look back, you're glad that you were disciplined, or the pain of regret, which comes after, and that can last forever, and it speaks to the broken spirituality that you were talking about. It's hard. And if I learned one thing from playing football, I like to footballize everything. It's just kind of my language. You go out there every day in football, and it's hard, and it's never perfect. It's like a struggle. And some days are better than others. But you're never going to be perfect. Like, no one's ever played a perfect football game. No one's probably ever been perfect with this. But what matters is that you wake up every day and you give it your best effort. That's what God asks of us. He asks for our effort. I notice you can't be 1 foot in and 1 foot out. You've got to be all in on this. And when you're all in for God's plan for marriage, He gives it back to you a millionfold. You can have an unbelievable marriage when you're living out God's plan and you are that one flesh with your spouse. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Bishop Cozzens. Thank you very much.
Just want to make a final but important point, which is the fact that to live this teaching requires great faith, and that Humanae Vitae and the failure to live the teaching is really a crisis of faith. And I think one of the biggest struggles that people have with it has to do with the fact that they haven't surrendered their lives to God just in the way that Matt was talking about when he accepted, okay, this is God's plan for my marriage, right? And there's a surrender of one's life to God that happens there, and there's a cost to that because it means I have to let go of control and I don't get to play God anymore. I have to surrender my life to God. And that's actually a very difficult thing, and it takes faith. And so helping people understand that is very important, especially when they can begin to see the beauty that faith brings. And this is part of the reason why NFP is such a great gift to marriages, because it takes faith to live. I don't get to have complete control. I don't get to have complete control in this area, and so I have to live it with faith and with trust in God. One of the things I've been trying to do this year is give talks to the young adults groups around the Archdiocese on Humanae Vitae and honor the anniversary. I've given a few of them already. I got a couple more. And one of my surprises has been that as I give these talks in like theology on tap and bars and things, that the question, I don't get a lot of objections to the church's teaching from the young adults who come to this. I get a lot of question about how do you know when is a serious reason to avoid having a child? Like, how do you know when is a serious reason to use natural family planning, and how to use it rightly? And that gets into that whole question of what it takes to live a life in marriage using NFP, which is this real life of faith in God and a life of prayer. Some of my friends in their practice of NFP, they talk about kind of 3 stages in a person's life as they're trying to live it, right? So there's that first stage when you're first married and you think you can conquer the world, and you're very excited about living the church's teaching because you want to invite God into your marriage. And then there's, 4 children later, and now you're tired, and you're experiencing some of the difficulties of marriage and all that means, and you have those years where there might be good reason where you need to avoid having children. And then there's all the trial and struggle that goes into those years, and those can be difficult years. And I think it's important when we're talking about NFP that we don't sell it too rosy, We talk about it as a faith journey, that in fact there are moments when it's difficult to live this teaching and it's costly, but how different it is to try and fail than it is not to try, right? The church has a Sacrament of Confession, and we have ways to help couples who are in that struggle of trying to live this teaching, which is so different than giving up when people choose sterilization or contraception, right? But then there's also the stage in life where you made it, where now your children are grown and you're out of that childbearing time, and you get to say, we made it, we were faithful, we actually did it, and that's a great sense of victory that comes. I want to just point out the necessity for prayer in the midst of that, to help people not give up and help people stay in relationship with God, because it's only through that you're going to be able to get through the struggles of that. Archbishop Hebda, maybe some of you saw it, wrote beautifully about this in the Catholic Spirit when he was writing about Humanae Vitae. And he said how in the Diocese of Gaylord, when he was first a bishop there, one of the concerns he had was his young priests being isolated out in the country parishes. They're so far from each other. And he was talking to an older priest about this. The older priest said, what you should do is have those young priests get to know the fathers in their area who teach natural family planning. Because those fathers will teach them about, discipline and also prayer and about trust in divine providence and generosity. And they'll be a great support. If they can't have other priests around, get them to know these fathers who are teaching NFP, because these are the ones who are really living the Church's understanding of vocation. Just one little story about this. I have friends, this is a true story, who they had 5 children, and the husband was a salesman, and he was really struggling in his work as a salesman, and for about a year had really struggled a lot, and so had made very little money. And so they were working really hard to avoid getting pregnant during this time because the finances were just so tight, and they already had 5 kids. And the woman discovered that she was pregnant, and so she didn't want to tell her husband, so she went to the doctor to make sure, and she found out she was pregnant with triplets. So she's mortified now. She has to tell her husband, there are very strong financial issues. Well, the husband came home that night, and she was going to tell him, obviously she had to tell him now. And he came home, and he himself looked just shocked and kind of shell-shocked, and she said, he sat down on the couch, and he said, I don't know what happened. He said, but today I made a sale, and I made 3 years' salary today. And she said, well, it's good, because I have news for you. But that's divine providence, right? And God will not be outdone in generosity. And we can expect miracles when we live in relationship with God. Just my final quote is from John Paul II. I love this quote. It's actually from the document on consecrated life. But he says this, it is in contemplation of the crucified Christ that all vocations find their inspiration. It is in contemplating of the crucified Christ that all vocations find their inspiration. This is what we have to help married couples understand, right? That in fact it's going to be by living their life in imitation of Jesus' self-gift on the cross, which is a total self-gift, which is fruitful, which is a marriage, that they're going to discover the beauty and glory of their own vocation. And it's really going to be that conversion of faith that allows them to see marriage for what it is. That is, it's a way of giving my life for the sake of others, and then that will bring me true joy and love. If we can help them to see that in faith, then they'll be faithful. Thank you.